Gospel of Luke, part of the story of Easter Sunday and the Lord's resurrection. We read, "Now behold, two of them were traveling that same day to a village called Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. So it was, while they conversed and reasoned, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were restrained, so that they did not know him. And he said to them, 'What kind of conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are sad?' Then the one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, 'Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem, and have you not known the things which have happened in these days?' And he said to them, 'What things?' So they said to him, 'The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, today is the 3rd day since these things have happened. Yes, and certain women of our company who arrived at the tomb early astonished us when they did not find his body, and came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And certain of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see.' Then he said to them, 'O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things, and to enter into his glory?' And beginning at Moses and the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Then they drew near the village where they were going, and he indicated that he would have gone further. But they constrained him, saying, 'Abide with us, for it's toward evening, and the day is far spent.' And he went in to stay with them. Now it came to pass, as he sat at the table with them, that he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, 'Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road, and while he opened the scriptures to us?'" Our next two readings come from the book of the teachings for the new church called Divine Providence. This first reading makes the point that if a person were to clearly see divine providence and its operation, he would deny God. And it goes on to say, this appears as unlikely, because it seems that if anyone were to clearly see it, that is, see providence, he could not help but acknowledge it, and so acknowledge God. And yet the contrary is the case. Divine providence never acts in harmony with the will's love in a person, but continually in opposition to it. For in consequence of hereditary evil, a person goes forever panting toward the lowest hell, whereas the Lord by his providence is constantly diverting him and drawing him back from there, first to a milder hell, then out of hell, and finally to heaven. This operation of divine providence is unceasing. Consequently, if a person were to clearly see or feel this withdrawal or diverting, it would anger him, and he would regard God as the enemy, and from the evil of his native character, deny him. Therefore, lest a person become conscious of this, he is kept in a state of freedom, so that he does not know other than that he is guiding himself. And the final reading states, "A person who has become spiritual by his acknowledgement of God, and wise by his renunciation of his native character, sees divine providence in the whole world and in every part of it. If he contemplates natural things, he sees it. If he contemplates civil things, he sees it. If he contemplates spiritual things, he sees it. And this in both the concurrent and sequential occurrences of things. In ends, in causes, in effects, in useful endeavors, in forms, in things great and small, he sees it. Especially does he see it in the salvation of people, as in the fact that Jehovah provided the Word, that by it he taught them about God, heaven and hell, and eternal life, and that he came into the world to redeem and save humankind. These things and more, and the divine providence in them, the person sees in spiritual light from natural light. The merely natural person, however, sees none of these things. If God exists, why doesn't he show himself? That's a really obvious question and a really tantalizing question. We probably all asked it at some point. For some people, that question is a meaningful stumbling block. If God existed, it would be so easy for him to show himself, and then things would be clear. If he existed and could prove it so easily, why wouldn't he? To this, some people might long to respond, but he does show himself. And if you really believe that, then yeah, it is clear, it is simple. It's not something you say because you're trying to be clever. And still, the fact remains that what shows him to us is faith, not evidence. We don't have any proof. Nothing that we can say about God is going to satisfy an empiricist. That's the hard truth, and sooner or later it comes home for all of us. There is an empiricist in all of us. There's a part of us that feels like it needs proof. And sometimes that need makes itself felt, and we don't always have a good answer for it. And so we ask ourselves if faith really makes sense, if this world really is filled with the presence of God, or if the truth is actually often a lot blunter and uglier than that. Even if we don't come to the point of doubting the existence of God, we all sooner or later doubt that he is really the God of our lives, walking with us. We want something more tangible, but we don't get it. What we have is faith. And faith can feel like it doesn't amount to much. In a way, we're all like those two disciples walking the road to Emmaus with the risen Lord at their side. He may be right with us, but we don't see him. What we see with our eyes is always just ordinary. It has no power to make us believe one way or the other. It's just another man walking down the road. In the story, it even said that the disciples' eyes were restrained so that they did not know the Lord. They weren't allowed to recognize him. How strange. Wouldn't he want them to recognize him so he could show them that he'd risen just like he said he would? Clearly, his priorities are different from those of an empiricist. The empiricist says that seeing God is step one and everything else follows from that. In this story, the Lord does reveal himself to the disciples, but at the end of their journey. Seeing him is something that we're led to little by little. And this story is about that process. As with so many aspects of the way God works, his decision not to show himself to us from the get-go is fundamentally about protecting our freedom. In order for us to become the angels that he wants us to become, we must be spiritually free. Our journey towards heaven is meaningful because we feel that we choose whether we take it or not. It would be impossible for us to feel this kind of freedom if, from the moment we were born, we'd felt the Lord watching over every step we'd ever taken. Even having another human being supervise us too closely can chafe. Maybe while we're learning a new skill, it can be nice to have someone watching over us and guiding us. But if we're ever going to feel that we've made that skill our own, the supervisor needs to go away so that we can do it ourselves. The Lord has the ability to see not only what we do, but also what we choose within ourselves. How could we ever feel that our choices were our own if we felt like we were being watched every single time we ever chose anything? That first reading from Divine Providence says that if the Lord let us see him all the time, and more to the point, if he let us feel all the time how he's working in our lives to change us, we would inevitably come to treat him as an enemy. Not only would we resent him for always watching over our shoulder, we'd feel that where he was trying to lead us wasn't where we wanted to go. He wants to lead us to heaven, but there's a very real and very powerful part of every human being that doesn't want to go to heaven. If we could see and feel him, we'd feel him gently but constantly redirecting us. And it's pretty obvious that if any of us felt someone's hands on their shoulders constantly guiding them, we'd pretty quickly start fighting that person. That would entirely undo what our God is trying to do. And so he keeps himself hidden, at least at the beginning of our journey. In the teachings of the new church, we're told it is a law of divine providence that a person not perceive or sense anything of the operation of divine providence, but still know about it and acknowledge it. Providence is hidden from us, even as the Lord was hidden from those two disciples on the road to Emmaus. All of us, like the disciples, are slow of heart to believe. If the Lord had let those disciples recognize him as soon as he joined them, would they really have recognized him? They didn't understand who he was. They were sad because his death had dashed their hopes. They didn't get that he was God who cannot die. Maybe if they had recognized him, they would have asked him how he'd managed to fake his death so convincingly and how much he had to spend to pay off the guards, or questions like that. They weren't ready to recognize him. And so he walked with them as he walks with us, unseen. Their inability to recognize his physical presence is one illustration of how his providence is hidden from us. Another illustration is their inability to understand his teachings. On the road to Emmaus, they explained to him that he was a prophet, even though he had told them that he was the Christ and the Son of God. They talked about his death like it was a defeat, even though he had told them that his crucifixion would be part of his victory. They just weren't ready to understand these things. And in fact, in one place where the Lord tells the disciples that he will be killed and rise on the third day, we're actually told, but they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them. In just the same way, we know and yet don't know the things that the Lord has taught us. The truth is written down in His Word, and it's all right there for us to read it, but we don't understand it. We don't see it until we're ready. As I said, our freedom is what's at stake. Whatever happens within our spirits must feel like something that we have freely chosen. In order to understand, we must be willing to be taught. In the story from Luke, the disciples were in the dark, but it does seem that they wanted to see the truth. As they walked, they were conversing and reasoning, trying to figure out what had happened. It's wonderfully ironic that they end up stumbling to explain to the Lord who the Lord really is. But maybe that very effort to understand Him is what brought Him into their midst in the first place. Asking the Lord, "Who are you and are you with me?" is a kind of an invitation. Tacitly we're saying, "Lord, come close and talk to me. Come answer me." When we're willing to be taught, the teacher appears. The disciples on the road told the Lord what they knew, and then they listened to what He knew. Beginning at Moses and all the prophets, He expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning Himself. Presumably, He showed them in all the scriptures that the Christ, who would be born in Bethlehem, who would be crucified and rise on the third day, was and is Jehovah, the God of heaven and earth. If only we could go back in time and listen to that conversation. And yet we don't need to. We have Moses and the prophets. We have the Word. We have the Lord's testimony as to who He is. And if we want to understand it, we will. When we're willing to be taught, the teacher appears. Still, it isn't teaching alone that shows us our God. No amount of mere understanding will reveal the living presence of our Savior. The Lord was known to His disciples in the breaking of bread. They invited Him to stay with them and insisted that He didn't go on any further. And then when they were at the table, the Lord took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Bread represents love. Love is what feeds our hearts and our souls. And breaking bread, we're told, means to communicate good from oneself and at the same time to appropriate it from oneself, thus to make love mutual. Breaking bread represents giving and receiving the same love, sharing the same heavenly food. When we've walked with the Lord, listening to Him, when we've asked Him not to go on without us, but to stay with us, then He sits down with us and breaks bread. He loves us and fills us with His love, and we feel that love. He loves every human being wholly and completely, and we can't love as powerfully as He does. But He gives us a piece of His love that we can make our own. It's in giving, holding, and receiving that love that we understand. This is good. This is eternal. This is life. This is God. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. In the instant that the Lord is recognized, He vanishes. Our glimpses of Him shining in His power don't and can't last. If we always felt Him overshadowing us, we wouldn't feel free. But when the disciples recognized the Lord, they realized that they had felt his presence all along. Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road and while he opened the scriptures to us? Think of the realizations that would have cascaded from that recognition. If the Lord is risen, then his death is not defeat. If that was the Lord, then he was and is who he said he is. God himself has been with us, and we did not know him. In that moment, the disciples were able to see divine providence woven through everything that had happened to them. But they saw it in retrospect. They didn't see it and feel it in the moment as it was unfolding. And that's the way it needs to be. The Lord wants to be seen. But every moment of our lives, we are free to choose whether we will see him or not. He will never give us proof that takes away that freedom. Our final reading said that a person who has become spiritual by living the Lord's truth sees divine providence in the whole world and in every part of it. But for these people, seeing providence isn't about proof. They don't see something that convinces them to believe in God. They see because they have already broken bread with God. They've walked with God. They've felt a burning in their hearts that's more real than all the evidence in the world. We don't believe in God because we see him. We see him because we believe in him. In the teachings of the new church, we're told those in the stream of providence are people who trust in the divine and ascribe everything to him. It should be recognized that to the extent that anyone is in the stream of providence, he's in a state of peace. And to the extent that anyone is in a state of peace by virtue of the good of faith, he is in divine providence. These people alone know and believe that the Lord's divine providence resides within every single thing, indeed within the smallest details of all. The good of faith is love. Love that's given to us because we have walked with God. That love filling up our hearts gives us peace. And a heart filled with peace sees God in everything. Peace is like the waters of a quiet river reflecting the sun in all its glory. And like sunlight, the Lord fills creation. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Amen.